March 5, 1957, Accra, Gold Coast. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. Outside the old polo grounds, thousands gathered under flickering lanterns, their voices a single, rhythmic chant. The beat of barefoot drummers was the city's pulse. For the British soldiers stationed nearby, it was an uneasy night. From the governor's residence, a brigadier watched the glowing square. "They're not rioting," he murmured. "They're celebrating." Across town, Kwame Nkrumah sat quietly. He wasn't in the suit of a Western politician, but the robe of an African leader. His eyes were fixed on the torches outside. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we prove that freedom doesn't need a gun." As midnight struck, Nkrumah stepped onto the stage. The drum stopped. A heavy, living silence fell. He raised his hand. At long last, his voice rang out, "The battle has ended. And thus, Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever." The roar that followed shook the night. As the Union Jack was lowered for the last time, and the new flag of Ghana rose, an empire quietly folded, not to the sound of gunfire, but to the powerful will of a people claiming their destiny. Seeds of rebellion without war 20 years earlier. 1937, Akimota College, Gold Coast. The afternoon sun beat down on the cream-colored walls of the school. Young students in crisp uniforms marched across the field, their voices echoing in unison, a mix of English discipline and African rhythm. Among them, one student, a young Kwame Nkrumah, stood out. He didn't shout the loudest, but he listened the deepest. He would later remember those days as the spark, when he began asking the forbidden question, "Why should our destiny be decided in London?" At that time, the British Empire stretched across continents, ruling over hundreds of millions. The Gold Coast, rich in cocoa, gold, and timber, was one of its most profitable colonies. Every railway, every office, every export crate bore the mark of British control. And yet, the people who made it all possible, farmers, clerks, teachers, had no say in their own governance. By the late 1930s, discontent was growing, but quietly. Instead of guns, there were petitions. Instead of barricades, there were classrooms. The fight began in minds long before it reached the streets. When Nkrumah left for America in 1935 to study, he carried a single suitcase and a head full of ideas. He took classes in theology and philosophy, but what truly transformed him were the people he met, black intellectuals, activists, dreamers. Harlem, New York, in those days pulsed with the energy of self-determination. Marcus Garvey's voice still echoed in the air, "Africa for Africans." In small apartments and church basements, Nkrumah absorbed lessons that would later shape a nation. The power of organization, the force of unity. The belief that liberation could be achieved without spilling blood. When he returned to Africa in 1947, the Gold Coast was restless. The British were still firm in control, but cracks were forming. Farmers were demanding fair prices for cocoa. Trade unions were organizing strikes. The old respect for colonial authority was fading fast. That same year, Nkrumah joined the United Gold Coast Convention, a political group pushing for self-government. At first, they wanted slow reform, not revolution. But Nkrumah, with his firebrand charisma and unrelenting optimism, saw no reason to wait. He toured villages barefoot, preaching self-rule not as a distant dream, but as a right. His message spread faster than any colonial bulletin. "We face neither east nor west, we face forward." Soon, tens of thousands followed him. Market women, dock workers, students, miners, they didn't carry rifles, they carried conviction. Then came 1948, a march of ex-servicemen, men who had fought for Britain in World War II, turned deadly when colonial police opened fire. Riots broke out in Accra, shops burned, people were arrested. And the British, shaken by the scale of the unrest, blamed one man, Kwame Nkrumah. They threw him in jail, but prison bars didn't silence the movement. If anything, they made him a legend. From his cell, Nkrumah wrote letters that spread across the colony. People began calling him Osajifo, the Redeemer. The British had jailed the man, but they couldn't cage the idea. By the time he was released, the Gold Coast had changed. The old fear of the empire was gone. And so, in 1949, Nkrumah formed his own party, the Convention People's Party. Its slogan was simple, self-government now. He didn't arm his followers, he gave them tools, leaflets, slogans, songs. He taught them how to use strikes, boycotts, and marches instead of weapons. We must achieve freedom without war, he told them, and remarkably, they did. By 1951, the British government, facing overwhelming public support for Nkrumah, allowed elections. Even from prison, he won by a landslide. When they finally released him, he walked out not as a prisoner, but as the leader of government business. The empire's old generals couldn't understand it. No army had fallen, no fort had been captured. Yet somehow, the colony was slipping through their fingers. The empire's quiet surrender, 1951. Christiansborg Castle, Accra. The sea crashed against the rocky shoreline below the castle walls. Inside, the corridors echoed with the polished steps of British officers and the quiet shuffle of newly elected African ministers. It was an awkward coexistence, the old empire and the new nation sharing the same corridors, pretending the balance of power hadn't already shifted. Kwame Nkrumah arrived that morning in a modest car surrounded by a crowd chanting, "Freedom! Freedom!" He stepped out in a white smock, waving calmly as British officials watched from the windows. Brigadier General Arthur Nanton, now posted as the military liaison, turned to his aide and muttered, "We used to land battalions to control this place. Now, we're taking orders from a man who walked out of our prison." Nkrumah entered the council chamber and took his seat at the head of the table. His voice was soft but carried weight. "Gentlemen," he said, glancing at the mix of African ministers and British administrators, "we are not enemies. We are partners in transition." Across the table, Sir Charles Arden Clarke, the colonial governor, adjusted his monocle and replied, "And what if London isn't ready for such rapid transition?" Nkrumah smiled slightly. "Then London will catch up." The next 6 years became a masterclass in peaceful revolution. Instead of uprisings, Nkrumah used administration, organization, and an unshakable connection to the people. He toured every region, speaking directly to farmers and traders, making sure his movement wasn't just political, it was personal. Under his leadership, the Convention People's Party built schools, improved roads, and pushed for African representation in every layer of government. He understood that freedom needed foundation, not fury. By 1954, the British could no longer deny reality. The Gold Coast had become ungovernable without Nkrumah's approval. His party won nearly every seat in the assembly. The message was clear: independence wasn't a request, it was inevitable. At the War Office in London, a confidential memo circulated between senior officials. It read, "The Gold Coast presents a unique situation. Public sentiment for independence is absolute. Unlike Kenya or Malaya, the threat is not from armed insurgency, but from overwhelming civil unity. Any attempt to suppress it militarily would destroy Britain's moral standing." In private, some officers scoffed. "Unity as a weapon," one colonel said. "What kind of rebellion sing songs instead of shooting guns?" But in Accra, unity was the weapon. Every strike, every march, every speech chipped away at the colonial structure until it stood hollow. Nkrumah's philosophy was simple: a nation could claim dignity without destruction. "We prefer self-government in danger," he declared, "to servitude in tranquility." By 1956, the final negotiations began. British officials flew in from London for tense meetings at the castle. Arden Clarke argued for delay. Nkrumah insisted on March 6, 1957. The date was symbolic, exactly 113 years since the Bond of 1844, when local chiefs first signed their allegiance to British rule. Now, that bond would be broken. At one meeting, Nanton watched as the last imperial papers were signed. He turned to a fellow officer and said quietly, "It's the strangest war I've ever seen. We lost without a single shot." Outside, crowds were already preparing. Tailors worked through the night, sewing flags of red, gold, and green. Children practiced songs about a country that didn't officially exist yet. And somewhere in the heart of Accra, Nkrumah sat alone, writing the final draft of his independence speech. He wrote not as a conqueror, but as a believer. He knew what the world would see the next day, not chaos, but confidence. Not rebellion, but rebirth. When dawn finally came, the Union Jack rose one last time above the castle. British officers stood at attention. Some felt relief, others felt shame. And as the sun climbed higher over the Atlantic, casting light on a new flag fluttering beside the old one thought echoed quietly through the ranks of the departing empire. How did they win without war? The day the empire stood still, March 6, 1957, Independence Day, Accra, Gold Coast. The morning sun was already blazing when the drums began. Long before the official ceremony, people flooded into the streets, traders closing their stalls, farmers traveling miles on foot, children perched on shoulders waving tiny paper flags. The air pulsed with song. This wasn't just an event, it was an awakening. British soldiers lined the route to the polo grounds, their boots perfectly polished, rifles gleaming in the light. They had been told to stand firm, observe discipline, but even they couldn't ignore the emotion swelling around them. Women threw flowers, old men saluted, and from somewhere deep in the crowd came the chant that had haunted colonial officers for years, Kwame Nkrumah. Freedom, Ghana. At the center of it all stood the man himself, calm, composed, his white robe rippling in the humid breeze. He moved slowly through the crowd, shaking hands, nodding, saying little. But everyone who met his eyes felt the same thing. This was no politician. This was a man who had convinced an empire to surrender through faith and will alone. Inside the governor's pavilion, Brigadier General Nanton watched the crowd with his jaw clenched. "Look at them," he whispered to a colleague. "They're celebrating like they've conquered Rome." The other officer smirked. Perhaps they have. By noon, the sun was directly overhead. The Union Jack hung half-mast. A hush swept over the grounds. Everyone, from barefoot school children to uniformed generals, turned their eyes to the flagpole. The old flag trembled in the wind. As the ropes were pulled, the British anthem began, solemn and slow. For a moment, you could almost feel the weight of centuries, the countless lands that had once bowed to this banner. Then, as the final notes faded, the flag slipped lower and lower, until it was gone. Silence, then a trumpet blared. A new flag, red, gold, and green with a black star at its heart, climbed into the sky. The crowd erupted, drums thundered, people screamed and cried. The black star caught the sunlight, shining like a promise. In the stands, Nanton stood frozen. His hand moved instinctively to his cap, but he hesitated. Then, slowly, he lifted it in salute, not to the empire, but to history itself. When Nkrumah took the podium, the noise softened into anticipation. His voice, carried by loudspeakers, rolled across the sea of faces. At long last, the battle has ended, and thus, Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever. Cheers exploded like cannon fire. Men wept openly, women all elated. The crowd began chanting, "Ghana, Ghana, Ghana." Nkrumah raised his hand again, waiting for quiet. "We have won our freedom not with guns or bombs, but with our hearts and our minds," he said. "The world must understand that the black man is capable of managing his own affairs." The words struck like thunder. In London, reporters scrambled to file dispatches. Across Africa, people gathered around radios, listening in disbelief. In Kenya, in Nigeria, in Rhodesia, young activists sat up straight. They realized it was possible, independence without war. The British officers remained where they were, motionless. The empire they had served all their lives was shrinking before their eyes. But there was no anger in them now, only awe. That evening, fireworks burst over the city. The streets filled with music, people danced barefoot in the rain. The smell of gunpowder and palm wine mixed in the air. For once, freedom didn't smell of blood. At the edge of the crowd, Nanton lit a cigarette and watched the sky. His young aide turned to him and said, "Sir, you think this will last?" He exhaled, eyes on the new flag waving in the night. "If they believe it will," he said quietly, "then it already has." In that moment, under the shimmering lights of Accra, one truth was undeniable. The British Empire had not been defeated by force, but by belief. The afterglow of freedom, March 7, 1957, Accra, Ghana. Dawn broke over the city like a gentle exhale. The night's celebration had barely ended. The streets were still littered with confetti, empty bottles, and flags hanging from windows. Children played with makeshift drums made of old tins, their laughter echoing down the narrow alleys. The scent of rain and roasted plantain hung in the air. Inside Christiansborg Castle, the old seat of colonial power, the Union Jack was gone. In its place, Ghana's new flag fluttered proudly in the morning breeze. The British officers who had remained to oversee the transition moved quietly, their uniforms slightly wrinkled, their expressions unreadable. Some would leave within days, others months. But they all understood what had happened. History had turned a page. Nkrumah sat in his new office overlooking the ocean. The waves were calm, steady, unbothered, as if they had seen this before, empires rising and falling with the tide. On his desk lay two papers, one, a telegram of congratulations from Queen Elizabeth II. The other, a letter from a group of African students in London, thanking him for giving them hope. He read both, folded them carefully, and looked out the window. "It's only the beginning," he said quietly. Across the city, ordinary people went about their day differently. A shopkeeper who once bowed to British inspectors now greeted customers with newfound pride. Teachers began lessons with stories of Ghanaian heroes instead of British kings. Even the soldiers of the new Ghana army stood taller in their freshly stitched uniforms. News of Ghana's independence spread fast. From Lagos to Nairobi, from Harlem to Kingston, people spoke Nkrumah's name with reverence. Newspapers called him the Star of Africa. Young activists studied his strategy, a revolution powered by unity, not violence. In British military clubs, the tone was more puzzled than bitter. Over whiskey and cigar smoke, retired officers replayed the events of the past decade, trying to understand how an empire lost a colony without a single battle. "They simply refused to fight us," one said. "They fought our idea of control instead." Brigadier General Nanton, now preparing to leave, walked one last time along the coastal road. He stopped by a group of children waving Ghanaian flags, singing songs of independence. They recognized him and waved. He smiled faintly and tipped his cap. He thought back to the night before, the roar of the crowd, the calm defiance in Nkrumah's voice, the sight of that new flag rising where the Union Jack had once flown. It was not defeat he felt, but something closer to respect. At that very hour, Nkrumah addressed his cabinet. "Now that we are free," he said, "we must prove to the world that our freedom was not a gift. It was earned, and it must be protected." His ministers nodded. They all knew the challenges ahead: tribal divisions, foreign interests, economic instability. But they also knew something stronger: belief. The same belief that had carried them to independence without war. Outside, a crowd began to gather again, smaller than the night before, but just as spirited. They sang songs of victory, not to a king or an army, but to themselves. And as the sun rose higher, the black star on Ghana's flag caught the light once more, glowing above a nation that had redefined what freedom could look like. When historians would later ask how it happened, how an empire was undone by speeches, songs, and a single unarmed man, the answer would always return to that night in 1957, because sometimes the greatest revolutions are not fought with bullets, but with belief, vision, and the unbreakable will of a united people. And on that night, under the tropical sky, the world learned something new: that the British Empire could fall to silence, to dignity, and to the power of peace. If you found this story inspiring, subscribe for more untold moments in world history, stories of courage, unity, and change that shaped the modern world.